Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Gina Boss. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Transportation Studies. And we are pleased to present this third webinar in our Freight 101 series. And as obviously by the fact this is our third webinar, if you missed the first two webinars, the recordings of them are available on the CTS website, and you can see the URL where they're located down here below, along with info about these upcoming webinars. So we've got three more in the series, one on rail on March 27th, April 3rd, urban delivery and logistics, and on April 10th, we'll be wrapping up the series with a session on trucking. So this series is part of CTS's 2025 theme, Unpacking Freight from Producers to Front Doors. And today's webinar is going to focus on the aviation sector and the role it plays in the movement of freight into and out of Minnesota. So before I introduce our speakers, I just have a couple of housekeeping items to share. So first, the recordings of this webinar and the presentation slides will be available on the CTS website on this Unpacking Freight page after the webinar. So if you want to go back and take a closer look at some data or some information presented on a slide, you will certainly be able to do that. And then second, I wanted to mention that as you're thinking of questions for Brian and Tracie during their presentations, please put them in the Q&A and we'll address them following the presentation. So our plan is to have both of them do their presentations, and then we'll have time to do the Q&A at the end. So really pleased to have these two experts and leaders in their area with us today. So we have Brian Peters, who's the Director of Air Service Development at the Metropolitan Airports Commission. And we have Tracie Walter, who is actually the president of Bemidji Aviation Services. And I've had the pleasure of working with both of them because they are also members of the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian, who's going to start us off. Brian?
Thanks, Gina. Good afternoon, everybody. Give me a second here while I just get the slide deck switched over to my screen. All right. All right, I believe everybody should be able to see that. Maybe just a thumbs up from Gina or Natalie, or?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, sounds good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, Brian Peters, I'm Director of Air Service Development for the Metropolitan Airports Commission, which, as pretty much everybody on this webinar knows, is the owner and operator of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. And that is where this presentation today I'll focus on. So when putting together this presentation, I thought what better than a nice summer shot in July of a large cargo aircraft taking off. And this is UPS's 747-8 that's here, not daily, but it's here, a few times each month, year round. And I thought, so after yesterday's snow, I thought it would have been really cool to have a shot with 12 inches of new snow on the airfield, but might as well keep us all thinking about warmer weather, as this was a shot taken in July of last year. Like I said, highlighting the UPS 747-8 that is here a fair amount throughout the year. All right, hold on, let's get a little switch here going. All right, so I thought I'd start out talking about, okay, what airlines have cargo operations at MSP? And of course, there are the notable carriers, FedEx, UPS, DHL, and then Prime Air, which is Amazon, are cargo-only carriers. But then we have 11 passenger airlines that also carry cargo in the belly of their aircraft. And that ranges from the smallest on here, smallest operator to be Aer Lingus, as they operate nonstop to Dublin. Seasonally, it was seasonal last year, but it will convert into year-round service starting this April. And it'll be a small amount of freight, but they are in fact a freight operator. And the largest passenger airline operator is naturally Delta, and Delta there is actually our third largest overall freight operator behind FedEx and UPS. one thing I also like to point out on here is that the European carriers you can see on there, in addition to Aer Lingus, there is also KLM, Air France, and Lufthansa. And one thing we've learned recently is that European and foreign carriers place much more emphasis on belly cargo and cargo activity than U.S. carriers, to the point where if you look at the U.S. carriers, so Delta, United, Southwest, American, etc., maybe only 1% or so of their total revenue is based on freight, whereas European and foreign carriers have up to 10 to 15% of their revenue is based on freight. So a much larger emphasis by foreign carriers, particularly European carriers, on freight in the belly of their aircraft than there is with U.S. passenger airlines. And essentially, most of these foreign airlines also have freighter aircraft as well. Delta, before them, Northwest, American, United also used to have freight aircraft at one point, but since all the U.S. carriers, since the earlier part of 2000s, have transitioned away from cargo aircraft. So that ties in when you look at our total cargo weight history. And I only tie this back to 2010. Because if you look at the period back all the way to 2000, our metric tons were quite a bit different. Because if you're in the early 2000s timeframe, 2000, 2001, as mentioned before, some of the U.S. carriers used to have cargo-only aircraft, and Northwest Airlines was certainly one of them. And as we all know, Delta acquired Northwest in the 2008-2009 timeframe. But before that, around 2000, Northwest had a rather robust air cargo operation. They had freighter aircraft, had a 747 freighter specifically. And if I were to take this chart all the way back to 2000, if you see, our total cargo peak was about 240,000 metric tons in 2018. Back in 2000, our peak was right around 400,000 metric tons. And back then as well, there was also a huge emphasis by Northwest of transporting U.S. mail. And I'd say of our MSP total 400,000 metric tons, about 100,000 metric tons alone was associated with U.S. mail. But since then, there's been a lot of change, a lot of acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, and a shift away from the U.S. carriers to no longer carry cargo, similar to how their foreign carrier counterparts do. So that's where putting this slide in from 2010 forward makes the most sense. So you can see a little bit of the history here. Total cargo volumes were pretty steady through about 2015, 2016. Then we get into 2017, 2018, and this is when Amazon showed up in our market, and it caused a little increase in the total cargo volumes. And then we wound up peaking in 2018. So then you can see there was a decline there in 2018 into 2019 into 2020. What was going on in 2018 into 2019 was something that we're hearing a lot about, and certainly in the news today, is tariffs and trade tensions. Tariffs and global trade tensions had downward impact on air cargo volumes in the 2018 into 2019 timeframe. And unfortunately, or depending on your perspective, we're hearing a lot about tariffs again, and tariffs are in the news. I believe there's another pause on the tariffs with Mexico for another month, and sounds like Canadian tariffs are going to be paused. Will be another pause on that will be announced shortly, but things are changing day by day, as we all know, with the current administration. So that was cited as some of the downward pressure on air cargo volumes in the 2018-2019 timeframe. And then we get to 2020, of course, when the pandemic strikes, and there's a big jump. So as passenger airlines shrunk operations, causing the drop there, cargo carriers picked up their activity and actually started peaking in the 2021-2022 timeframe. And since then, since that peak, when you get back to our peak of, since the pandemic was 237,000 metric tons in 2022, there's just been downward activity with the air cargo environment. As you recall, during the peaks of the pandemic, other modes of transportation were stressed, and it put a lot of short-term demand on air cargo. And since then, air cargo has been largely in a downward trend. And that was the case certainly last year, 2023 into 2024. So if you take another look at how our total cargo weight breaks down, you look at the cargo-only carriers, so that's FedEx, UPS, Amazon, and DHL are the vast majority of it, whereas the belly cargo carriers, led by Delta, of course, pick up the bottom end there. So if you look at the big five, you could say, so FedEx, UPS, Delta, Amazon, and DHL. That is essentially, of that 200,719 metric tons, that essentially 97% of that activity is done by those 5 carriers. Another way of looking at things is how MSP ranks compared to all of our peer airports in the top 30, top 35 airports in the United States. And naturally, you have Memphis, Anchorage, Louisville. Memphis, hub of FedEx, Louisville, hub of UPS, are at the top of the list with total cargo in the 3 million, high 2 to 3 million metric ton range. What's interesting on this slide, though, is that you can see the good chunk of red here. So essentially 18 of the top 33 airports have seen downward volumes in air cargo since 2019. And I also include on this slide, so MSPs in this range, 200,000, 203,643, that was based on 2023. We dropped to 200,719 in 2024. We don't have full year 2024 stats available for every airport. ACI, Airports Council International, typically publishes those in the June-July timeframe. So the most current data we have to show rankings across our peers in the US is through 2023. But something I like to point out here is you may wonder, why are we ending at 33 and not 35? Well, 33 fits on a slide better than 35. That's part of it, but also always interesting to see how we compare to our counterparts at Detroit, given that we are very similar facilities, very similar airports, being that we are both Delta hubs, and you can see their volume is a little bit less than ours overall. So next thing I talk about now, I actually didn't really think about this until prepping this presentation is, well, where do we have nonstop cargo service to and from? We certainly have very broad passenger air service to 165 markets throughout the world. Essentially 130 of those are in the United States and 35 of those are international. But I thought, I've never really looked at where are nonstop cargo only destinations. And there's essentially 11 markets here that are operated direct nonstop to by FedEx, UPS, Amazon, and DHL. So FedEx naturally going to their world hub in Memphis, but also to Indianapolis, Omaha, and Fort Worth in Texas. UPS to their world port in Louisville, but also Rockford outside Chicago, Winnipeg, and Philadelphia. Amazon operates to Fort Worth, Cincinnati, and San Bernardino, and then DHL operates to Cincinnati and Milwaukee. So if you look at, that's where our main line, our large cargo operators operate nonstop to. Where the smaller regional turboprop feeder operators talk to. And you're certainly going to hear all about Bemidji and her world in a few minutes here. But just so I point out that there's also about a dozen destinations inside Minnesota, in Wisconsin, Nebraska, and then also into the FedEx and UPS hubs in Indianapolis and Memphis as well by Bemidji. And these are basically our 5 largest regional turboprop operators: Bemidji, Encore Air Cargo, Mountain Air, IFL, and CSA Air. And they all provide feeder service for UPS, FedEx, DHL. Well, I thought I would go back. Hold on, bear with me here. I just thought of something. So one thing on here, when we talk about airlines with cargo operations, one carrier that's missing on here that had been historically is Sun Country. So Sun Country is our second largest carrier, essentially accommodating about 10% of our total passenger activity, whereas Delta accommodates about 70%. But Sun Country in 2022, 2021, 2022 decided to get out of the belly cargo business. But one thing you may be aware of is that Sun Country does operate cargo only 737 aircraft on behalf of Prime Air. So the primary activity that occurs at MSP is probably, I'd say 2/3 of it operated by Sun Country aircraft. So just a tidbit there as to why you may have wondered why Sun Country is not on this list. They used to be, but they've gotten out of the belly cargo game, but they are in the for hire flying cargo aircraft business with Amazon. All right, so here's a snapshot or a look at the aerial photograph of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. And most of us are very familiar with this, but I thought I'd just have a little geography lesson as to where the various carriers are operating. So in this area, you can see here's where FedEx and UPS operate in this midfield area in between our runway, kind configurations. It's affectionately known as the FedUp ramp, but that is the home of FedEx and UPS. Amazon and DHL are in a facility on our West Cargo ramp, just close to Cedar Avenue, Highway 77. And then also Amazon has warehouses down here in Air Cargo Center in the area just on the southwest corner of the airport. The belly operations of all the non-Delta carriers, so that's United, American, Alaska, Aer Lingus, Lufthansa, everybody else operates out of buildings on the southwest corner of the airport in the Air Cargo Center area. And their activity is actually tugged from Terminal 1 via roadways, under runways, across ramps, and through a gate to get the cargo in and out of the aircraft out of the Air Cargo Center area. One area up here you can see is the vacant parcel above the Amazon DHL ramp. And that is land that we have available and reserved for air cargo expansion. And I will talk about that next year as we get into a recent study we conducted to help us understand better what our opportunities may be to grow air cargo. It's largely understood and believed by operators at FedEx, UPS, and Delta that they have adequate space, facility capability, capacity to accommodate their operations for the next 20 years. So through 2040 into 2020 into 2045. So there aren't any facility challenges holding back FedEx, UPS, or Delta from growing air cargo activity at MSP. Where we are pinched is in the Amazon world. Oh, DHL is also in good shape. We did an improvement and an enlargement of the DHL facility about 7-8 years ago. So they are also in good shape capacity-wise. Where we are pinched a bit is with Amazon. Amazon is bursting at the seams between their space on the West Cargo ramp there and down in the Air Cargo Center area. But also Lufthansa, the other carriers are pinched quite a bit as well. So we look at the opportunity to expand, and we'll hopefully be in the process of constructing a new facility on that vacant parcel. There's essentially 19 acres there to better accommodate Amazon and to also provide options for others to grow at MSP that aren't associated with Delta, FedEx, UPS, or DHL. So one thing we also completed this year, so close followers of MFAC are certainly familiar that in 2021, we conducted our first high-level overview study of the air cargo environment at MSP through a consultant with Landerman Brown. And that confirmed a few things that this was in 2021, that, okay, a significant chunk of our air cargo activity does in fact first truck to Chicago. We were within a 5-6 hour drive of Chicago. So essentially 50% of our international, sorry, I didn't say it before, our international air cargo activity first gets on a truck and goes to Chicago and then boards aircraft for international destinations from there. So one thing we wanted to learn a little more is, okay, what is this product? Where is it going? And what might we be able to do to help provide other options for manufacturers and businesses in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities, Minnesota region to have better access to air cargo international shipping options. So last year we kicked off an air cargo demand study with an additional consultant group that was just wrapped up in 2020. That was just wrapped up in 2024. And what we learned, so everybody is pretty familiar with the large concentration of medical technology device companies that are operating in the state of Minnesota. So confirmed naturally that the region is home to large concentrations of med tech companies, and they do in fact generate significant demand for air cargo service. Med tech devices are prime candidates for air cargo in that they are low weight, high value, and time sensitive. All things that are rather critical components in necessitating the use of air cargo. We also were relatively familiar with this, but the study also confirmed that the med tech industry is very fragmented. There are very few large companies, but many, many small companies, well over 100 plus located throughout the state. So you can think of the large companies, the Medtronic, the Boston Scientific, the Abbotts of the world, but there's only a handful of those. The vast majority of the companies are very small in nature. One thing we also learned is that there is med tech demand globally. So there's certainly demand to Europe, there's demand to Asia, there's demand to South America. So given that geographic dispersion makes it a little bit of a challenge to say, okay, attracting a new freighter flight to, say, Europe would essentially accommodate half of that medtech demand that exists in the Minnesota market. As mentioned before, Chicago provides a very strong value proposition in that they have essentially a cargo hub that's been in place there in the Chicago market for decades, and is certainly part of the challenge we will have in attracting new international air freighters to Minneapolis, St. Paul, given the networks that are already established through Chicago O'Hare. And then I touched on a second ago about the additional cargo facilities being constructed in that vacant parcel. So once again, this is where we are starting to seriously plan the construction of new facilities. So where are we going from here? So let me just summarize that we've learned a lot about our demand and where it is going throughout the world and the companies we need to talk to. So now we're in the phase of developing strategies to have conversations with cargo carriers, cargo freighters, about what opportunities they may have to start nonstop freighter service internationally from MSP, as essentially all of our existing freighter service is domestic in nature, with the exception of a flight to Winnipeg. So with that, we are starting to focus on that more closely this year in the process of developing that strategy, and then we will be identifying carriers to start talking with. So I primarily work in the passenger airline recruiting business and have been speaking with passenger airlines about growing service at Minneapolis, St. Paul, but I've never really had focused conversations with cargo airlines about adding nonstop international service from MSPs. So later this year, we'll have our strategy put together, and we'll be planning to start conversations with potential freighter airlines that could possibly bring nonstop freighter service into Minneapolis, St. Paul. And with that, I think I am wrapped up, and I will stop sharing and hand it over to Tracie, and understand we're going to have questions at the end. So thank you for the time, and I'll hand it over to Tracie.
Thank you, Brian. Let's see. So we figured out when we started, my screen likes to share large because I have a large screen. We'll see if I can get this to go right. We couldn't figure out how to downsize it. So can everybody see it, even though it might not just be filling their screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Brian. I'm really glad that Brian went first, because he gives you some great information about how our operation that's based in Bemidji, Minnesota, fits into the scheme of how freight gets distributed, kind of that more of the last mile freight in the air world. So it's a little brief history. We are a full service fixed base operator. Our main headquarters is in Bemidji. The original owners of this company bought it in 1970. I started here in 2000 as just a line pilot. So I was just flying one of the airplanes you see on your screen. Became the director of operations in 2005, the vice president in 2016, 15, somewhere in there, 17. And most recently, I became the president last May. So been here a while. We have about 90 employees. So besides being a fixed base operator, which is generally we service all of the planes at the airport. We're a Part 135 operator. We're highly regulated in the FAA. This is one of our aircraft. We don't just operate in Minnesota. This picture was actually taken out in Colorado by one of our, I just love it with the double rainbow. It's just a beautiful photo. So we kind of take small town America to the rest of the world. We're not the only ones in the business. Brian gave you a couple others. We deliver everything from critical to the routine through UPS and DHL. A route map structure, as you can see, Bemidji is our headquarters. We're one of the longest run operating FBOs. And as well as we have our main maintenance base there and a repair station. And in the FAA, that's yet another regulated certificate that we have to run and operate. Minneapolis is by far our largest base of operation for aircraft at one location. From there, I'll show a more detailed map here in a bit. But from there, we go to Duluth, Eveleth, Grand Rapids, International Falls, Bemidji, Brainerd, as well as Rice Lake and La Crosse, Wisconsin. UPS in the recent years has been in cost-cutting efforts, so they've deleted some runs out of the Minneapolis system. Those would be Marshall and Alexandria. Within the past couple of years, Alex actually just got cut this last fall. Cost cutting, they figure they can run a truck cheaper than running an airplane. The Alexandria area was not thrilled that they no longer get an airplane. We also have a Fargo base of operations. We have a maintenance team there and 2 aircraft that go to Devil's Lake and Jamestown, and then 1 out to Bismarck. And in Denver, we operate out of Denver International, and we have runs that go out into Nebraska, Kansas, and then southern Colorado and out into the Rockies. At the Minneapolis airport, just to give you a perspective, the same size of aircraft you see on the left is the same size of aircraft you see on the right. We are a small but mighty part there. We use the airport at different times of the day when it's really busy. Where you're generally departing around the 7 a.m. when everybody else is departing the area, and we land between 7:30 and 8:30 when everybody's coming back in. So we play a big part in the flow of traffic. For years, we've been a part of team meetings that go on in Minneapolis through MAC and stuff. So it's a really great relationship, and we've been there for quite a few, well, for years. That's where the freight goes in and out of. So Brian couldn't give you a nice snowy picture, but I did. This is not from the other day, however, this is from a while ago. If you see the rainbow yellow kind of tail on the left there, that airplane isn't that color anymore. So you can tell how old that picture is, but it's a nice snowy airplane. We fly in all of the weather, whether it's snowing or raining. You know, if it's 40 below or 100 degrees, our pilots are out there, the UPS employees are out there. Our main customer at Minneapolis is UPS. However, we do have a route for DHL, and I'll explain that in a little bit. We go to Greater Minnesota, so I'm glad Brian covered all of Minneapolis, so I will cover the rest of the state. On the left, it's what we do. We bring freight into a smaller airport. Most of the airports that we fly into do also have a what they consider commuter service with usually SkyWest, Delta. However, we do service airports that don't have airline service as well. So we leave Minneapolis on a Tuesday morning, and we fly to the one on the left happens to be Bemidji. Our aircraft sit there for the day. When the UPS truck comes out or DHL truck comes out, we give them all the freight. UPS, DHL, whomever goes out, delivers their freight, and then brings back freight in the evening. And then we fly back to Minneapolis. These are our locations for Minnesota. Thief River Falls is strictly a DHL run that basically does DigiKey. But they do 2 round trips a day. We also service Brainerd, Bemidji, Grand Rapids, International Falls, Eveleth, Duluth, and then I have the Rice Lake and La Crosse. This is a map we tend to use when we do interviews and teach people about what we do. So it gives you a good perspective, Greater Minnesota, and it helps people understand what we do. What we haul. If you've ever gotten a cell phone in a box at your house, this is what you're going to see: lithium-ion batteries. You're not supposed to put them on passenger aircraft, but they can go on a freighter. So if you're out in cabin country in Brainerd or up in the lakes by Ely and you drop your phone down the fishing hole in the winter or off your boat or your pontoon, and you go, oh no, what am I going to do? And they get a phone the next day, it was probably on one of our aircraft. Other things we haul, medical supplies, there's a lot of those going on. biological substances, we see a lot of medical items going on on and off our airplanes. Leisure food, so after you dropped your phone in the lake, you still want to have your lobster for supper. So we have a lot live lobsters, just an idea. I actually have hauled an entire non-blow up kayak. It barely fit in the airplane, but that was during COVID and someone must have really wanted their kayak. Lots of excuse me, construction and farming stuff. It's very next day era. I need this piece of equipment going and I need to finish my farming. I grew up on a farm just north of Minneapolis. I know how important it was whenever my dad had a broke down tractor or whatever, that part be there the next day. And that's what we provide on greater Minnesota and all of those other areas, North Dakota, Colorado. And we also do a lot of flowers for your moms and loved ones during Mother's Day and Valentine's. So I wish I could put Brian's scale that he had up on when he showed volumes or weights. Something that I continually talk about no matter where I'm at is that the FAA and the government only track weight and metric tonnage. They don't track volume. But who hasn't gotten a package with one thing in it in the bottom? It looks like kind of a screwdriver or something with massive amounts of paper on top from Amazon versus a box full of books neatly packed. We see a volume increase. We don't see a weight increase. In fact, when I look at my statistics in our aircraft, our weight has decreased and our volume has gone up. And that is pretty much all over the system with our aircraft and other companies that do similar stuff that we do. So I really like Brian's scale of how the weight goes down, but nobody tracks how the volume is continually going up because less things, there's less things in a box, but there's more boxes. Something that people have discussed is how do you upgrade these older aircraft that we fly. 10 years ago, we took we looked into our future and we upgraded aircraft that were built in the 60s and 70s with nice new electronics. These are very modern cockpits. When you look in a new aircraft, Boeing aircraft, Airbus aircraft, they have some of this technology. A few years ago, I had a UPS pilot with me and they were like, we don't have any of this fancy stuff. So I really like to show this to people to know that a company, small and mighty as we are, have really taken the step to modernize our aircraft to make sure that our pilots are the best trained flying out there in the system with all of the passenger airlines. Aviation safety has really taken a hit in the last couple of months. And I'm proud to say that we really, really emphasize safety and our pilots have the best things in front of them to make sure that they're flying safe in the system. So, and it also helps us retain pilots. It's pretty cool to have these type of equipment in our aircraft. Kind of into our culture, just how we work so we keep pilots and excuse me, mechanics. We're very family friendly. We have the rural or the city items. I just had a retirement and the gentleman was here for 41 years. We have mentorships with mechanics and pilots. Having a small Minnesota owned company. We are an employee owned company, but we have 4 bases that people can live at. We also have our challenges. Some of our challenges within the aviation industry are skilled labor. Mechanics are very hard to find. Other things are airport fundings for smaller airports. Everybody thinks Minneapolis, but do they think Brainerd, Duluth, International Falls? There's the little airports that kind of get forgotten about. And unless you're there every day, you're like, so it's important that the aviation network looks at beyond passengers and they look how this freight goes out. I mean, are they getting their medical supplies? Are they getting that thing that can fix their fix their machine so they can keep going, whether it's in mining or farming? I know in MFAC, there's been more than one conversation about the DOT drug and alcohol testing and how Minnesota decided they voted in that marijuana was legal. It is still not legal in the FAA. And we actually talk regularly about it within our employees, and CBD as well, because it's not regulated and nobody knows if it'll test positive on a drug test. So it's one more thing that we educate, and it's a challenge. I made this slide yesterday. One of our pilots took this. This is actually in Denver, but we're small but mighty, and we're gladly part of the team of hauling freight everywhere throughout the US, even though we just have a small fraction of it out of Denver, Minneapolis, and Fargo. I circled our airplanes. I really thought this was cool. Our little Queen Air coming up in Denver with all of the Southwest and Delta flights behind it. And then on the back, there's a Beech 99, which is our middle-size aircraft on what we do. So we're out there with the big boys, but we're gladly a small but necessary part of the team for freight within Minnesota, connecting all of the small communities to Minneapolis where they can get in and out into the international world. So I'm going to stop sharing and go from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I've got a couple of questions to get us started, but encourage all of you to put your write your questions into the Q&A so that we can use the rest of this time for some discussion. So there are a few in the chat that I'm gonna, or the Q&A that I'm gonna start with. So the first one is, and this would be for you, Brian, the comparison with Detroit, does it include the traffic at the Willow Run freight only facility near Detroit?
Yeah, thank you. No, that number I have is for Detroit alone. Anything at Willow Run's pretty small. So yeah, that's not in the numbers.
Okay, great, thanks. And this one might be a little more challenging, but I actually did pull up the slides from the MnDOT presentation on the freight, freight plan. But one of the next question is, how do the peaks and trends compare to freight movements by all modes? And I don't know, Brian, if you want to offer.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense on that, so I'm glad you might.
So I did, like I said, I did look up the slide that we had previously, and so in terms of tonnage and value, trucking is by and large the primary mode. In terms of tonnage, it's at 69% or 63%, and then by value 69%. And air is, and that's sort of followed by rail and pipeline and water for tonnage. But when you look at value, and so I think that gets into some of the things that Brian mentioned are like with the med tech industry and other where there are more high value and high dollar freight. The picture changes slightly when you look at value, and air is actually even more, is more than water, for example. So, and it does show, so when MnDOT did the update to the freight plan, they looked out ahead to 2050, and there's an increase is shown moving in the more positive direction. Let's see. And then I don't know if you have anything to share, Brian, related to military freight movements at MSP.
Not particularly. So at MSP, we're a home of 2 C-130 bases, right, for the Minnesota Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve. And we don't have any data that we get from them on what they're actually carrying, whether it's troops or freight or equipment or whatnot. But one thing I can share is that I was just looking at seeing that question pop up. I pulled up our year-end ops statistics, and military operations were up 30% in 2024 over 2023. So like I said, that's just operations. So that's just landings, takeoffs and landings from MSP. But what exactly is in those aircraft is probably heavily shrouded in mystery, as most things with the military are.
Great. Yes, I imagine. So this next question, it goes back a little bit to Brian's question, but I'd be interested also in Tracie's perspective on this. How does Bemidji Aviation, regional airports, other Part 135 cargo operators, and other greater Minnesota connectors play a role in MSP's air cargo strategy to attract and retain air cargo services that might be trying to capture the Chicago leakage? Who wants to start?
So from our side, we are a contractor, so we have direct contracts with UPS and DHL. We don't go out there and hunt cargo down. If we do hear of anything, because we tend to hear different things, we direct those towards UPS or DHL. I don't have specific routes that are for one customer going to a specific airport, like Medtronic or something. Medtronic is not reaching out to Bemidji Aviation to fly stuff. We do the occasional charter for like specific parts from, we used to do some from Articat to a different facility in the southern states. Every once in a while when like a line would break down and they needed to, it was gas tanks or something, plastic gas tanks. I remember doing those. But we don't really have that type of information. It's not something that we're specializing in right now.
And I could add on to that as we dig in and make progress, hopefully with attracting a nonstop freighter here, that operator will certainly be interested in capturing as much as they can throughout the region. So there could be growing activity, could certainly influence a growth in activity from throughout the region to help fill that aircraft and make it hopefully as successful as it possibly can be. So to be determined.
Sure. Well, and Tracie, I mean, you mentioned briefly the relationship or the work that you do for DigiKey. So obviously that is focused and it's industry or company specific, but I mean, can you share a little bit about how that came to be?
That's actually mostly just through DHL.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah, the DigiKey, for those who don't know that, it's like the largest employer in Thief River Falls. I know several people that work there, but there's some very interesting things that go on with the Thief River Falls Airport because of DigiKey. It's a wonderful place to, have that big of a company. But we do see just what goes in and out of the airplanes. DHL has a route to Thief River Falls because of DigiKey. UPS and FedEx have larger aircraft there, contracted like we are, that go to directly from Thief River Falls to, one goes to Louisville and one goes to Minneapolis, and they get direct flights. And it's, from my knowledge, it is the smallest airport that Memphis and like FedEx and UPS have out of their main hubs. There's nobody else doing it. And I know everybody's trying to attract that business out of there. A lot of the stuff that we end up hauling to Minneapolis for DHL is international volume. It's going back and forth internationally, most of it. But UPS and FedEx have just reworked their system. It used to go through Minneapolis or Fargo, but they've got, and they still do, they still put out ground trucks into their system, but then they also have a late night freight flight to Memphis and to Louisville and then back to Thief River Falls in the morning.
Wow,
it's a large operation.
I was going to say, it's fascinating to hear the impact that one industry can really have. I mean, it has a lot of economic impact, obviously, in the air, but just the impact for your business and the work that you do. So maybe following up a little bit on that, Tracie, as you mentioned, challenges are funding for greater Minnesota airports or regional airports. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit more of what, at least of what you might know of how these airports are funded or where they receive funding.
So airports are normally funded, and it's been a long time since I've sat through how airports are funded. I know a little bit more about Bemidji just because I'm here and we run a business at this airport, but they're funded through state and national funding, mostly through fuel tax. Brian might actually know a lot more than I do, just how MAC is funded. And there's landing fees, there's fuel flowage fees, there's grants, there's all kinds of different things that funnel money to airports. And you have to be pretty, I would say you have to be pretty savvy if you're a small airport to know how to get that money. We've recently realized there's a small airport that just never really got funding because if they didn't know how, or the one person that wanted the funding didn't know how to get it. So they kind of fall off the radar, and then the airport goes into disrepair, and then you're like, I can't do this. And they're like, well, we can't raise taxes. And I'm like, you're supposed to be able to get funding somehow. So it's kind of who is the right grant writer, or who has the loudest voice in the room to get the funding to the airports.
Great.
Yeah, I'd say
Ryan knows
that.
a lot more than I do.
Well, no, I'd say as far as smaller airports go, that's pretty much spot on. Big airports like MSP, we're funded by user fees, right? You use the airport, you pay for it. We don't have anywhere near the extent of grants, and well, we do, but not on a percentage of our total budget. Concessions, you fly, you take a passenger flight, you park at the airport, you buy a hamburger in a restaurant, passenger facility charges, all those things weigh into how larger airports are funded.
Great. Brian, this next question is for you on the slide that you had with the different airports. Yep. It said that this person noticed that Chicago was up by 10% and Minneapolis was down by 10%. Sure. Is there any relationship there? Is that just thoughts on that?
Not at all, really. I mean, we really don't carry any cargo by airplane to Chicago. All right. But if you look at Memphis and you look at Louisville, FedEx and UPS are 95% of our total activity. So our volumes are going to largely go with FedEx and UPS. So we're down 10%. Memphis is down 10%. So no surprise that those are closely intertwined. And Chicago is not as heavily influenced by FedEx and UPS, but they're influenced by many, many other factors, other freighters, other passenger activity, and they're more of a gateway type airport than a hub for a FedEx or UPS. And so yeah, definitely some nuances there, but Chicago's much different than a Memphis or a Louisville, who heavily influence what our volumes are.
Great. This next question, if either of you have a sense of how much air cargo goes into the Rochester airport, and if I mean, obviously they have both Mayo and MedTech, but do you have a sense for that, and if they have plans for trying to attract more of that type of?
Well, nothing by airplane really goes between Minneapolis and Rochester, but yeah, I'd say FedEx, Rochester has their nonstop FedEx flights to Memphis, and I would say is largely Mayo driven, more so than anything med device related at this time. And yeah, they certainly have ambitions of their own. I'm not as familiar as those, but yeah, they would like to certainly attract more options to that market also.
Tracie, anything on that one?
I didn't even realize FedEx had a direct flight there. I thought they had cut that out at one time, but maybe they put it back. So yeah, well, and I know UPS puts it into Minneapolis, and since it's such a short drive, it just gets driven there.
Yeah.
Well, and now would be a good time for me to put a plug in for the fact that next month in April 23rd and 24th, the annual Minnesota Airports Conference is going to be held in Mankato, and that is focused on the greater Minnesota airports as well. So there's a lot of information that's shared at that conference. So just a little plug, if you're interested, go to the CTS website to get more information. This question is for you, Tracie. What are some of the largest growth opportunities for a Part 135 cargo operator like Bemidji Aviation?
The biggest growth we've had in honestly the last 10 years is another company going out of business, not really out of business, but taking a different angle and us moving in. The Part 135 cargo operation is pretty saturated. I will say that, and it's going to be the ones who survive that have been around and figured out how to do it. I am proud to say that we are survivors. I plan on keeping employees and making money in Minnesota and elsewhere, but that's one of our growth opportunities, is going out of Minnesota and into other opportunities. So we only started the Denver operation in 2015. So it's been 10 years since we started that operation. And that has grown and shrank too as we've been out there. Fargo for UPS actually started in the fall of 2019. They moved a lot of their operation out of Sioux Falls and up to Fargo because they were seeing such growth into the North Dakota area. So,
Great, thank you.
Yep.
These next two questions are both asking about advanced air mobility and what you from a industry perspective, where might there be opportunities for drones, for example, to maybe enhance or supplement air cargo?
I don't have a lot of insight into the future of AAM. Joe Block is certainly the go-to in this community on that, but it's certainly something we have on our radar. But yeah, I don't have real good insight into how that may influence air cargo activity in the near term. Probably more so longer term, but near term, probably not so much.
Okay. Tracie, any thoughts?
It's funny because I was actually at a conference not too long ago that the Minnesota Electric Aviation Network was doing, and is it Joe or Josh Block?
Joe.
That I believe he was there. Pretty sure. I'm looking at my notes going, yeah, they happen to be sitting in the same collection. And we talked about electric aviation and some of the drone type stuff there. So it is coming. I have some knowledge. I'm not by at all an expert on it. But there are some areas, some cities already that's getting that quick response for medical stuff around the small cities or larger cities where you don't have to wait for all the traffic.
Well, and I'll offer another plug. So I don't know if we've finalized the details yet, but we, as part of this freight theme in 2025, we are, along with MnDOT Aeronautics and the AirTap program that's housed here at CTS, which is the Airport Technical Assistance Program, we are going to be co-sponsoring a couple of advanced air mobility webinars. So more to come on that. And Natalie is on top of things and has included the link. So if you're interested in learning more about potential there, I would encourage you to check out those webinars as well. So any final questions from the group before we sign off? This has been really helpful, and I think that it's perhaps, although we do see the FedEx planes and and the UPS planes and the cargo reps, I don't think we always think about the role that air aviation plays in the movement of goods. And so Brian and Tracie, just really want to thank you for your presentations and also your comments. I think that it's really important for us to have a complete picture of how things move, and obviously there's integration with other modes, right? So that's another element of it. Tracie, you had the great example of how you fly things in, and a UPS truck or a DHL truck is going to pick it up and take it and bring things back for you to bring either back down to the cities or to wherever you're going. So just really important to see those connections. So thank you both so much for that. All right, well, I think
Sure.
those are the last of our questions. So I am happy to convene or to adjourn the webinar and hope everybody has a great rest of the day and enjoy the sunshine here in Minnesota. So thanks, everyone. Take
Thank you,
care.
Gina.
Thank you.